Well, hi there, Faithful Politics listeners. And if you're joining us on our YouTube channel, our viewers, thank you so much for coming on another day. Just make sure that you follow us, hit like and subscribe. We definitely really appreciate you guys doing that. We love bringing you great content and want to continue to do so. You can really help us out in those ways. And as always, I'm your faithful host, Josh Burtram, and we have your political host, Will. It's good to see you, Will.
Yeah, it's good to be seen. Thanks, Josh.
It always is. I appreciate that. And today we have the distinct honor of having Steve Bezner on the show today. He is the senior pastor of Houston Northwest Church in Houston, Texas, and is a passionate advocate for reclaiming the teachings of Jesus in the American church. He holds a PhD from Baylor University and is an adjunct professor at George W. Truett Theological Seminary. Steve is actively building interfaith relationships through the Multi-Faith Neighbors Network and trains future church leaders through GlocalNet. In his latest book, Your Jesus is Too American, Steve challenges the church to prioritize kingdom values over cultural conformity, urging a return to service, generosity, and reconciliation. He, of course, lives in Houston with his wife and two sons. And we're talking with him today about that new book, Your Jesus is Too American. Steve, thanks so much for joining with us on the show today. There it is. Will's holding it up.
Josh, Will, thanks for having me on today, guys. I'm really honored to be here. Really appreciate it.
Absolutely. So I got to ask, title. Did you come up with that? Did the publisher come up with that? How'd you do the title? And why did you write a book about Jesus being too American?
Yeah, so I have to confess first, the publisher came up with a much better title than I did, but they captured the ethos of what I was trying to say. So my original title was pretty lame, and they came back and said, "What about this?" And so definitely it hit what I was trying to say.
Can you share that original lame title?
I mean,
so
I think
curious.
my original title was something like Kingdom Values, and they said no one will buy that book.
It's like,
that's a much. They did come up with a better title.
The Writings of Steve.
Yeah.
The Writings of Steve, Musings of Steve about Jesus.
Yeah, but they understood what I was trying to say, which was that most church members or the majority of church members in predominantly white evangelical spaces are being co-opted by American culture. I think that most of the time the conversation centers on politics, but I don't think it's exclusively politics. I think just American culture has become such a pervasive force within the specifically American evangelical space that over and over, Christians have forgotten that being different is actually their greatest strength. And so that's why I wanted to write the book.
That's really interesting. And even though, you didn't come up with the, the title, the title does imply that Jesus is too American, which gives me the impression that, like, if Jesus was just a little bit American, like that's okay. Like, help me sort of just like work through the spectrum of Americanness and how it's applied to Jesus.
Yeah, no, that's a fair point, Will. I think the point I'm trying to make is that most American Christians think of Jesus in an American way. And they think of Jesus as being American in the way that we're American. And what I was trying to do is say that's too American in your thinking. We've got to revert back to scriptural ways of thinking about Jesus, which will then help us re-envision scriptural ways of embodying faithfully the church in the 21st century.
Yeah, that's really, really, really cool. I totally agree that there's a sense that Jesus like matches this American persona of, what it means. I've even had, a lot of times I've heard pastors in the past, more than now, probably because I don't listen to them as much, these particular pastors, but like almost like this Jesus is this like very manly, like according to masculine standards of American, a certain kind of masculinity in American culture, that this is the Jesus, he's masculine, this is who he is, and reject any other view or persona of Jesus. Why do you think this American to American Jesus? Why do you think this is problematic? What is it about this that's creating issues in our churches and families and culture?
Yeah, a great question. I don't know what things are like in Richmond, but I can tell you that in Houston, I see a lot of vehicles that drive around with a cross that is inlaid with the American flag. And I think that that is probably the easiest way for me to describe what the problem is with Americanism and Christianity. It's that somehow American might and American rightness have been combined with the vision of Christianity. I'm sure you guys have seen pictures like with Jesus, wearing an American flag sash and that sort of thing.
A MAGA hat?
Yeah, right. And I think that kind of vision is a Jesus that really doesn't fulfill the things that we see Jesus teaching in Matthew 5, 6, 7, Sermon on the Mount, not the things that we see in the Gospels themselves. And so the problematic comes in when we're confused why people who are Christians in the United States don't understand why we get upset whenever they mirror those more American kinds of ways of living, American ways of thinking. And those of us who are pastors are saying, but this doesn't have anything to do with Christianity. So I think that kind of it was born out of this recognition that a lot of my people were being discipled by either Fox News or MSNBC, but then in addition to that, they were being discipled by Amazon and by Apple and just by kind of the American way of life. And so I really wanted to kind of hit the reset button and say, how do we point back to the vision that Jesus had? So I think that to kind of circle back to your question, that problem is that every piece of culture is pulling Christians to live in a different way, and we're trying to point them back to a more faithful way to live.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and I'm curious. I heard somebody mention recently that what's so unique about America is you can have somebody from France, Mexico, where Korea come to this country, become a citizen, and they become an American. And that doesn't necessarily apply to other countries. Like if I were to go to Germany, for instance, I wouldn't necessarily be considered German. But here in America, we do. So like Jesus being kind of a part of the fabric of, American society, like what's so wrong about, Jesus, being able to, be considered an American? Recently Trump mentioned that if Jesus was counting the votes in California, he went in a landslide, so what's so wrong about having a sort of pride about your country, a sense of national pride, and having your faith at the same time?
Yeah, great question, Will. I would say there's nothing wrong with having national pride at all. I am the most stereotypical suburban dad in that sense. I have been in Disney World on July 4th crying at fireworks as patriotic music played. I have done that.
Nice.
My grandfathers were both in the military. I'm one of those people that's like, fired up to really give respect to those who have served in the armed services. All those kinds of very traditional patriotic mindsets I'm in. But that being said, Houston, if you guys don't know it, radically diverse city. Super diverse. And one of the things that I notice about my friends who come to Houston from Mexico or Guatemala or from China or wherever they come from, they are excited to become American citizens, but they still like to preserve distinct portions of their unique heritage. And so, we can go into Chinatown, Koreatown, we can go into other neighborhoods where all of the signs are in Spanish. And we have no doubt that these people who live there are American, but at the same time, they're saying, we want to be American, but we also want you to see how our particular culture is unique. And I think that with Jesus, as Christians, what we want to do is kind of live in that way, to say, man, we love America, we're glad to be here, we want to participate, we don't want to try to in any way undermine the country, but we want to also show you our distinct way of life, which is centered on love and peace and reconciliation and generosity, et cetera, et cetera. So I kind of think of it in those terms of like walking into Chinatown, Koreatown to say we're sort of a unique neighborhood, so to speak, whenever our congregation gathers, that when people walk in, they say, okay, these people are American, but they're American in this unique expression.
That makes sense. I'm curious how much do you think people's, sense of national pride and patriotism is influencing, folks' hermeneutics, or, ways that they're kind of interpreting the Bible?
Yeah, I think everybody brings a hermeneutic lens whenever they read the Bible. I mean, everybody does. And so I think that as far as national pride, it kind of depends on probably that particular individual's national pride. But, I mean, I don't know about you guys, but I've seen memes or whatever we would consider these to be on Facebook that has a picture of an American soldier or a tombstone in Arlington Cemetery that then has a Bible verse underneath it, greater love hath no man than this, that he lay down his life for his friends. Now, obviously, in one sense, that's totally true. But in another sense, it can be confusing because it takes the idea of a soldier and the notion of Jesus dying on behalf of the world and begins to conflate those two things. And so I think that that's where the national pride piece comes in. It can kind of have us read verses and overlay ideas that really aren't intended. And we could all sit here and say, okay, well, sometimes that's good, sometimes that's bad, depending on particular cultural context. But I think that in general, whenever we try to bring American culture as the lens, we end up missing the radical message that Jesus was trying to teach in the first place.
Yeah, I really like that, kind of parsing that out, because I think on one hand, you're right. Like when someone gives his life sacrificially, right? That you're giving your life for the sake of someone else. That's a great act of love, right? That I think is kind of this probably a universal sense of like, yeah, that's an awesome act of love. And yet also taking all of the connotation of a military uniform, the implication that when someone is, fighting for the country, now again, it's sacrificial, right? So we can look at and see, almost like parsing what is sacrificial and what does look like Jesus, but then even being more careful to look as well, what are the differences, right?
Yeah.
What are those things that Jesus represents that are different or even potentially in tension with some of the cultural norms that our society have? What cultural values and then kingdom values, right? You even mentioned that you thought about naming the book about kingdom values.
Yeah.
What are those kingdom values? And just maybe even like an example or two of a kingdom value that stands in tension with some of the cultural values that we have today.
Yeah, that's a great question, Josh. I think, well, I'll stick maybe to begin with the military example we were just on. I think that we all would agree that there are times when, for whatever reason, military force has been necessary to defend innocents, etc. At the same time, in the particular example that we just gave, where we talked about putting that Bible verse under a tombstone at Arlington Cemetery, what ends up happening is not simply that we give honor to the fallen, but we end up sort of transposing this almost godlike quality onto members of the military. So there's a place where we can honor those who have served, and then there's a place where we can honor to the point of deification, if that makes sense. So I think that that's kind of one example of dangers that can come in. I think that with regards to the values specifically, I would say probably the one that jumps out to me the most is power. I think that the American way, in one sense, the American dream is to get a better house, a bigger salary, a more quote unquote successful lifestyle, to have as much influence as you possibly can. And you want to do that in ways that usually cause you to step over others so that you can get ahead. And the Jesus way, the Jesus value would be a value of service and a value of deciding that you would actually influence in your community, in your family, in your workplace, in your nation by choosing to serve through love. And that would make a bigger difference. You guys already know this. If someone forces you to do something, if they impose their values on you, you immediately resent them. But if they show you a more beautiful or more compelling way to live, then you get to choose that way of life, then you really enjoy it and you appreciate it. And I think that a lot of what we have seen with regards to recent versions of Christianity is we see a version of Christianity that's trying to impose a certain way of life on people who have yet to choose Jesus at all. And I want to say, no, the vision that Jesus gave was one of serving and loving that then draws other people in. And if they're drawn in of their own choice, of their own free will, then it'll be a much more compelling picture of Christianity. There was a scholar at Baylor many years ago named Rodney Stark, professor of sociology. Rodney Stark wrote a book called The Rise of Christianity, and he just talked about how the church grew in its first 300 years. And he said that the way that the church grew in its first 300 years was not through any sort of political activity, but by simply being faithful, serving the poor, serving the sick, taking in abandoned children, all these sorts of things. And in doing so, it was so different from the predominant culture of the Roman Empire that the church exploded. And eventually it became influential enough to become the official government of the empire, obviously, under Constantine in, I get 315 or something like that. So I think that that's kind of the compelling part of that, is that historically we see that when the church embraces its difference, embraces those values, it can end up having more influence than we actually believe.
That's really cool. This is kind of a side note, but like, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the band Bad Religion, but they wrote a song called American Jesus, which is, it's almost like if your book had a soundtrack, that would be a great song for it. It's
okay,
not.
I'm going to have to put that on there. All right.
They're a punk band, and the song doesn't necessarily. It's not like they're beating up on Christians. They're basically talking about sort of this American form of Jesus, and it's just really fascinating. But to that degree, I'm curious, like if you can give us, with whatever level of specificity you feel comfortable with, a version of this American Jesus that you see that runs very counter to what you know to be true scripturally. And like I said, you can kind of pick whatever example that you think would best articulate your point.
Yeah, I think that the most common version in my part of the world is the part of the world that, as I've already said, mentions patriotism with religion to the point of it becoming a kind of a new, unique religion. But I also think that we could point to individuals across the country. I think the one that comes to my mind immediately was, and I'll be honest, I don't know if he's still doing this, but was the guy Greg Locke, who had like the tent church that I believe is in Tennessee. And he was interviewed. I was trying to remember which book it was. Golly, I'm going blank on this. I'll probably, Tim Alberta's book. In Tim Alberta's book recently, he interviews Locke. And Locke basically says, I don't believe 90% of this stuff that I say, but at the same time he knows that it really meets his crowd, right? And so there's this sort of folk wisdom meets Christianity meets patriotism, that there are certain pastors who they just know that's going to sell, it's going to build, draw large crowds, and man, they play to the crowd. And I think that for the people who are on the stage, maybe they think, well, it's just harmless. I don't really believe it. But you guys know as well as I do, the people who do buy into it, who look around, they see 1,000, 2,000 people saying this is the way, then they will make life decisions on how they spend their money, how they live their life, how they treat their neighbors based on that sort of lifestyle. So those are the versions that I think we have to gently push back on.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up at least sort of pastors' role in this, because I know Josh and I have had conversations about this, that you know people's interpretation of the Bible, especially if they didn't go to Baylor or whatever, like they're probably going to learn from their pastors or the leadership of their church. So like what is it about pastors you know, teaching this form of Christianity that does tend to take on a lot of, conservative Republican overtones, and causing people to, inlay, American flag inside of a crucifix or something.
Yeah, it's a great question. I wish I knew totally. I just have ideas. I can tell you, my theories. I think one of those theories are that Christianity has always been a faith that is based in proclaiming the truth. And the idea of proclaiming the truth is that Jesus is God's son. So it's definitely a message that has been less popular in certain cultures at certain times. Well, I think then that what has happened over time is that less popular countercultural narratives have been meshed with Christianity. And anytime that pushback comes, people say, well, we're just being punished for telling the truth. Because it's sort of this idea, we tell the truth and we say the things that people don't want to say. You'll even hear people, talk about pastors and say things like, he's not afraid to tell it like it is, that kind of a thing, which is always so funny to me, because I think, man, if you say what Jesus said, I mean, that'll be way more controversial. You want to say something that'll really scare people, right? I mean, you start saying things like, yeah, we ought to probably be giving more to the poor. We probably ought to be really focusing in on being more peacemaking rather than peacekeeping. These kinds of things, man, you're gonna freak people out in those part of the world. But man, as someone who has been around church a long time, I think that a lot of guys feel the pressure to have a large crowd because that's how the bills are paid. And so you're tempted to play to what you think people want to hear rather than what they need to hear.
Yeah, that is, I totally get that. I totally feel that. I totally like have that same temptation, even though I have a pretty small church, and it even feels like many times like existential, whatever you say, like if I say the wrong thing, if I upset, even one family that's a significant portion of the church, and it feels existential to be thinking about that and be wondering about that. And you're like, this is how my bills get paid. This is how my mortgage gets paid. This is how I put food on my table, is by what I say. Essentially, I mean, it's more than that, right? But if you get up there and you say something that makes people angry and makes them so angry that they stop coming, that is just that. And I think acknowledging that is really important, and bringing that in for people that have criticisms against pastors that say things they don't like, or pastors that say things that they do like, or I wish that pastor said more, just spoke, whatever he thought. And it's never that easy, and it's never that simple, because you are judged by what you say as a pastor, primarily from a pulpit and from a public standpoint. And then that actually has real material effects on your life, more so than it would on the person that comes and then they decide they want to go to the other church with the guy that's willing to preach about, whatever culture war issue that's out there, and they're actually the ones that are speaking truth.
No, yeah, you're right.
I mean, it's totally, I feel that so much. And it goes back to this, how do we define success? And I see these couple things in American culture. We define success by power, by money, by political influence, right? So if you think about churches, they define success by number of people in the seats and the size of the budget, and then social media reach. Now, right? So then what is Jesus saying? And how are his teachings in tension with those pursuits? And you've kind of alluded to that, but even go into more detail. I'd love for you to go into more detail on how does the church redefine success in a way that aligns with Jesus' teachings?
Yeah, I mean, Josh, I think you just said it. I think, being faithful to what Jesus teaches and playing the long game. Now, that's easier to say than to do for people who are pastors. I mean, you've already just really clearly articulated the challenge for a lot of pastors is that if you choose to be faithful and to follow this, your church might push back against that particular vision of what Jesus teaches, and then they may decide to go somewhere else. They may decide that you need to go. You don't need to be the pastor of that congregation any longer. And this is really one of the unique dynamics in evangelicalism as opposed to other denominations. I come out of a Baptist tradition. We don't have bishops, and we don't have a hierarchy that gives us sort of the freedom to say the things that we feel convicted to say, because my livelihood is not tied to what the congregation's opinion as much as it about my theology, as much as it is about my bishop's opinion about my theology. Well, in the evangelical, non-denominational Baptist milieu, you're in a space where it's essentially a referendum whenever you begin to say things that are unpopular. Now, if you've been a pastor a long time, you're going to get a little more leeway, but I think that whenever you begin to push back on cultural idols and cultural ways of thinking, cultural values, you're going to begin to run into those things. So that being said, faithfulness, I think small steps towards faithfulness over time will yield results in congregational living. I think that any pastor, any congregational leader, and if you're not in a congregation leadership position, just to be able to say, what can I do in my family, my school, my neighborhood to take a small step towards embodying a faithful representation of what Jesus taught? That, to me, is the way that we actually begin to make differences locally that can then, over time, turn into something pretty significant.
Yeah. So you've been a pastor a long time. And I'm curious, like, how does one go about teaching their congregation about this stuff to a degree that it's like there's no confusion of what you're talking about? Meaning, if I were to go to your church, I would attend the worship service, great music, the meet and greet, which I've always hated, by the way. And then you get up there and the first words out of your mouth are like, congregation, your Jesus is too American. I don't know if you would do that or not, but I venture to guess most pastors probably would not start a message that way. So like, how do you navigate those issues, talk to your congregation and say, hey, like the Jesus we're seeing in America right now is counter to the Jesus that I've been teaching you all about for X number of years. Like, how do you navigate those conversations?
Yeah, so first of all, Will, my wife also hates the meet and greet, so I want to let you know that.
Thank you. I love your wife already.
But the second thing I would say is that pastoring ideally is a relational vocation that takes place over time. Most of the people that I know that get frustrated with change within a congregation try to move way too fast, or they never try to do anything and just want the congregation to figure it out on their own. So you can't do either of those. I do think that, to your point, I would probably not start a sermon with your Jesus is too American unless I had been the pastor of that congregation for some time. But what I probably would do is I would teach through the Sermon on the Mount. And as I teach through the Sermon on the Mount, I have plenty of opportunity to contrast what Jesus taught. So whenever Jesus teaches on, peacemaking, and when Jesus teaches on meekness, I get to hold up peacemaking against violence. I get to hold up meekness against power. I get to sexual purity versus sexual licentiousness. I get to generosity versus greed. I mean, over and over, these values are going to come up. And then over time, like any good preacher, right, you start out with an interesting story, draw people in, they're listening to you. Then you start to lay down some, theological foundations are good. Then you can say 2/3 of the way through, so your Jesus is too American. And they go, whoa, okay, maybe it is. But I think that's what we have to do, is to discern the speed at which our congregation can move. Every congregation moves at a different speed. Every person really moves at a different speed. And so we have to say, what's the vision that Jesus has given, and how can I move that way? And do I have enough relational capital to lead my church to move in that direction? I would say that, again, in Houston, as I mentioned, a very diverse city, I think that for us, one of the very first things that we did was we said, let's look at our congregation and ask the question, do we look like our neighborhood? And the answer was no, we did not. And so I said, okay, if we believe that God so loved the world, that means everybody. If we believe Revelation, that every nation, tribe, and tongue will be present in the heavenly throne room, then that means that God loves every person. So what do we need to do, and how do we need to pray, and how do we need to think in order to see our church look a little more like the neighborhood? Now, I've been at my church almost 12 years, so we've seen big strides in that particular area over the last 12 years, but it didn't happen in 1 week. It wasn't like we showed up the next Sunday and, man, our church suddenly reflected the demographics of the neighborhood. And I kind of think of that as an example that is, the way that really church operates in a lot of different spheres. We have to say, okay, what's the issue? What's the speed with which I can move? And how can I show that it has foundation within the scripture, is based on what Jesus wants us to do?
In your experience, like, have you seen a shift, of patriotism mixed with Christianity? Are you seeing, or have you seen this blending of the two increase or decrease since you've been in ministry?
Since I've been in ministry, definitely an increase. I don't know about recently. I feel like we may have hit the pinnacle of that, and maybe on the backside to where that's being viewed with a little more suspicion now. But I think that part of that is people who have been in the United States for their entire lives, I think, are oftentimes have a Christian background, Christian heritage, and they have seen, the United States in positions where they felt like the nation was healthy, and they sort of correlate that with how strong the church was at that particular moment. And so I think that they, say, well, those two things have to be related. So the nation is healthy when the church is healthy. Obviously, I would say the same thing, but instead of saying, okay, let's make the church healthy so that then the nation could become healthy, I think what ends up trying to happen is let's either combine the two, or let's put the church over the nation, as opposed to the church becoming a healthy influence. It becomes sort of this lord over, if that makes sense.
I have this tension when I think about our politics, our religion, the way in which we live out our lives, because I'm thoroughly American, right? I think that my ancestors have been in America since Jamestown. I know that my grandfather traced Burtram, that's my last name, so all the way back to Jamestown. I'm not sure about the Turner side. But we've been European, right? As that's where my DNA is, and then American for since Jamestown. So I'm thoroughly American in every sense and heritage, and the way that I think and the way that I operate. And yet I would like to think that I'm thoroughly Christian as well, and I look at the way that these two things are conflated, and it definitely bothers me. I definitely see the contradiction. I definitely see how, cultural values can't just be mapped onto Christian values and vice versa without there being conflict. I believe that more now than I ever have, and yet I still feel like I am constantly left in this tension of how can I do both? How can I be American and Christian? How can I be faithful to Jesus while still being loyal to my country, which I love and still consider the greatest country in the world? And should I feel bad about considering it the greatest country in the world? Some people would think I do, and that's okay. They can have that. I'm open to learning why that is an issue more. But it's like, I want to have this patriotism. I love this country. I think this country has done an enormous amount of good. I know that it's done a lot of bad too. I know that all that is about perspective as well. But I don't look at any country and say, "Oh yeah, well let's point to that country and how good they've done," and they're so much better or whatever it is. I mean, again, any of that can be argued, and I'm open to any of those conversations. But I'm trying to figure out, how do we cultivate a culture that brings both, like that basically cultivates both our American uniqueness and personality and our pride in America, and at the same time follows Jesus faithfully? And is that possible? Some people would say it's not possible. What do you think?
I may be an idealist or a dreamer. I do think it's possible. I think that for the Christian, the rule of thumb is to make certain that my identity as a Christian is first, in my opinion. And I think that when I start with my identity as a Christian, if I live that identity based on what I see in the Sermon on the Mount, based on what I see in the Gospels, and live in the way that Jesus would call me to live, I think that I can live in that way and at the same time thoroughly appreciate the fact that I am allowed to do so freely. I think freedom of religion is a thoroughly American invention and is a thoroughly beautiful thing. And I think that gives me a peg on which I can hang my hat and say, I love this nation. I'm so thankful for it. I'm grateful that I have the opportunity to worship freely. I think that from there, it then allows me to freely love the people around me and to appreciate great things about my country. I think the other thing, too, is that being a Christian gives me the courage to, as you talked about, Josh, to critique my country whenever I think that she is not living up to the standards that we ought to have for her. I mean, MLK famously said that the church is the conscience of the state. And I believe that the church in the United States today, particularly evangelicalism, particularly white evangelicalism, could learn a lot from that particular statement and have the courage to be prophetic at times that are not necessarily aligned with talking points that feel very comfortable. So in other words, I feel like most evangelicalism would be very comfortable being prophetic on the topic of, say, abortion. I think we're probably a lot less comfortable being prophetic on the topic of, say, taking care of the poor. And those are things that I think we could actually really remake the nation in a way that would help us love her better if we didn't allow any party on the left or the right have the predominant model of thinking, but instead let Jesus control our thinking. And then that would give us the ability to be prophetic in a way that we could be speaking into our country because we want to make her better, because we do love her. It's just like your kids. You discipline your children not because you hate them, but because you love them. And we want to discipline our country, so to speak, to use that turn of phrase, because we love her and we want to see her be the very best version of herself that she could be.
Yeah. Steve, is this your first book that you've written?
First book.
Yeah. I do have to ask, like, what was it that made you want to kind of jump into this fray of like faith in politics? Because you mentioned Tim Alberta. He wrote a phenomenal book, The Kingdom, Power, and Glory. There's Andrew Whitehead, American Idolatry. I mean, I've got so many books on my bookshelf that have just been released recently. This one by Grace Kim, the Your God is Too White. Like this seems like a a great time to write a book like that, but then two, a terrible time to write a book like that if you want to sort of stay under the radar. So like, what was it that really kind of spurred this, I don't know, motivation for you to want to get yourself beaten on by everybody and yeah.
I've never been the smartest, I guess, Will. I honestly, I mean, I know I sound like a pastor when I say this. I really felt like God put that on my heart, but B, Tim Alberta, Andrew Whitehead. I wasn't familiar with that most recent book. I'm gonna have to check that one out. But I think that those are all more scholarly perspectives or memoir perspectives. I really felt like there needed to be a pastoral voice in the conversation that said, let's not focus so much on denigrating the church, because, in the book, I'm not trying to tear down the American church. I'm really trying to say, let me give you a more beautiful and compelling vision of how to live as an American Christian that I think actually will be more effective. Because whenever I talk to people, I know you guys have these conversations, whenever I talk to people who are Christians that are afraid, I don't get the sense that they loathe America or that they loathe the church. They want the best for the church. They want the best for our country. And so my tactic is that the best thing we can do to love America is to be the most faithful version of the church that's possible. And the way we do that is we go back to what Jesus taught. So I think if we go back to what Jesus taught and follow his ethic, his way of life, live that out faithfully, it makes the church stronger, which in turn makes the church grow, I believe, which in turn then would have greater influence in our communities and in our nation. So I've tried to portray it as a message of hope, whereas, I think that some of the other books are more of, here's a diagnosis. It's pretty stark. It's not often uplifting. And that's good. We need those kinds of analyses because we need to, facts are friends. But I've really tried to write a book that would be more hopeful and would say, I really believe that if we will move this direction, then we can see change in a beautiful and positive way.
That's really awesome. We have spoken to Tremper Longman, who is this really, really smart theologian. And he wrote a book. People that follow our show have heard me say this before, but he wrote a book called The Bible and the Ballot, which is a phenomenal read. And what he does is he takes a lot of current day political issues and applies like the biblical text to like how we should really think about it. And so, he uses. There's like one chapter where he talks about, Christians feeling like they're being persecuted or something. And I'm paraphrasing how he responds, but he's like, yeah, that's kind of what the gig is, like as a Christian, you're going to get persecuted. And there's just so much depth there. And I really kind of get the sense that your book does a lot of the same things, which I love and appreciate. But I'm curious, like, how's your book been received since it's been released? Like unicorns and butterflies kind of thing?
Well, technically I'm still in pre-release. Early returns are positive, but, I think that just like you guys, I think that you probably resonate with my message. We'll see what churchgoers who sit in pews think whenever the book is officially released. I do think that it is kind of this sense that I believe that what that book you were just talking about, Will, the idea of the ballot in the Bible, I think that persecution is one of those things that Christians have been warning one another about in America for a very long time in evangelical circles. I just think we're being persecuted in areas where we're not, and it's because we're not willing to step into the spaces that would actually get us persecuted. I think that if we really leaned in on peacemaking and really leaned in on those kinds of reconciliation efforts, we might be persecuted, but it would be for like what you were saying, for the right reasons. And Christians all over the world are being persecuted in other spaces, and most of the time it's because they're choosing to be faithful, and they're not, the places where they're being persecuted, they have zero political influence. If they had political influence, they wouldn't be being persecuted. But they're staying faithful, embodying these things. And I think that we've got a true blessing in the sense that we're in a space where religious freedom is real. So if we embody faithfulness here, we can potentially see positive cultural change, in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree with you. This idea that we're persecuted and really we don't quite understand what persecution is certainly experientially in America with the freedom that we have that is unprecedented, right? Historically, I understand why people don't want that to come to America, and I understand why people get concerned about that and almost see something that looks like it could lead to that through a series of cause and effect relationships and events, and say, I want to stop that here instead of waiting till it's there. So I can definitely be sympathetic to that kind of thinking, but it is like, I don't know how much, like, yeah, we're not really getting persecuted, so we can be thankful for what we have. But you said something really interesting with that persecution, is that if we were stepping into the spaces, certain spaces, we might experience that, like peacemaking. And I would love for you to go into deeper detail with what you're talking about there. I think about marginalized groups. I think about how the church has played a part in marginalization of ethnic minorities, of religious minorities throughout its history, and how it's done some pretty wicked things in the name of Jesus, attaching his name to something that it should never have been attached to. And I see that in the history of the church, and I think about now, right? What do we do now to make up for that? Are we supposed to apologize for that? I didn't do that. I don't think I've ever persecuted someone on the basis of their religion or on the basis of their race or on the basis of what their sexual orientation or any of that. I don't think I've persecuted anyone, in my opinion. But so do I need to apologize? I'm trying to get in the mindset of, like, a lot of people I've heard, a lot of conservatives that I've heard, and I am definitely lean much more conservative than liberal. And I can understand why people wrestle with this stuff. And I can understand why someone's like, yeah, we need to apologize and own that. But I also see why people are like, why should I apologize for something I didn't do or something I'm not a part of? How do we navigate the marginalization issues and kind of build those bridges and make peace with the past and make a path forward in the future?
Yeah, I'll be honest with you, Josh. I don't know that institutional statements make a ton of a difference in most cases, but I do think that individual and community actions make a ton of difference. So I'll just give you just an example from our church. I don't know if you guys remember the Pulse nightclub shooting that was in Orlando. Muslim shooter went into a predominantly, I think it was a gay nightclub, if I remember correctly. And at the time, it was the most, I think, the most deadly mass shooting in American history. The day after that, or 2 days after that, I was driving to my church office, and I drive by a mosque every day on my way to my church. And I just kind of felt a nudge from the Lord that said, you need to go in there and talk to those people. They could use some friends today. And I was like, yeah, I don't really know that I want to do that, but okay. So I whipped into the parking lot, and I'll skip to the bottom line of the story. I ended up getting to have a face-to-face with the imam of the mosque. We ended up going to eat together, and we've become friends. And our congregation has attended iftars, breaking of Ramadan evening fast at their mosque. Many from their congregation came a couple of years ago to one of our Easter services. I don't want to exaggerate, but about 30 of them came. We've done kickball tournaments together, which leads to all kind of, fun jokes about the Christians dominating the Muslims, vice versa, that kind of stuff. But I share that with you to say that those kinds of things at the community level, we haven't changed our theology. We're still an evangelical church. They think that I am sorely mistaken about 99% of what I believe and vice versa. But embodying love of neighbor, sharing meals together, those kinds of things, they go a long way. So as we built that relationship, we invited what I guess you would call the kind of the elders of the mosque over. So Joy and I hosted them around our dining room table, had them over for dinner, had halal dinner, and then Joy, my wife, researched the type of tea that they would like to drink and served that with dessert. And they felt loved. Now, no one around that dinner table converted to Christianity that night. However, I feel like Jesus was honored. And so whenever people kind of ask me those questions, well, how do we do this? I think that a lot of times we start with too lofty of goals. We start thinking institutionally, nationally. And I try to challenge my church in saying, look, I don't have the governor's phone number. I don't have the president's phone number, but we can meet the people in our communities. We can build bridges there. So table fellowship, serving in your community people who you would consider to be ideological opponents or potentially even enemies. That's the way that hearts are changed. That's the way that ground level change occurs. And to me, that's the best path forward. And those are the things that open doors, I think, for greater change.
Yeah. So, one of the things that's been in the news lately is Christian nationalism. And we spoke with this really amazing professor, Miranda Cruz, who wrote a book aptly named Faithful Politics. And she said something in our interview that like really stuck with me. She said, Christian nationalism, isn't about making people, or isn't about turning people into Christians. It's about making people act like Christians. And I'd love to just get your thoughts on Christian nationalism, especially kind of in the context of, patriotism and spirituality. So, yeah.
Well, I think that she nailed it. I think that Christian nationalism is and of course, there's a lot of different definitions, but the version I think we're talking about is a version that wants to impose an extreme Christian morality onto the nation, because I think everyone would agree, well, we need, certain aspects of Judeo-Christian ethics, etc. I don't think that's what we're talking about. But whenever we start talking about kind of an extreme version of morality that's punitive, whenever people don't behave like Christians, I don't know about you, but to me, that feels like it would build massive resentment among people who are not Christians. I think it would honestly destroy the church's witness. I think it would probably end up causing the church to shrink, because I think that people would be honestly disgusted with that kind of heavy-handed religion. And I think if you look in history, any time that Christian nationalism really has been tried, it's failed. And there's not an example that we can point to in the world and say, here's where Christian nationalism has worked and has really helped the church. Pretty much in every instance, even if a veneer of Christian morality was maintained, the church was, in the long run, destroyed because of it. So I really think that if we think that the best way to build the country is to build a healthy church, then we need to do that without governmental intervention, and we need to just focus on building faithful church members who love Jesus that can build individual faithful churches that in turn can do great work in their communities. So, yeah, I mean, Will, I think that your guest was correct, and I think that the best thing that we can do is not to impose that kind of morality and that kind of a vision onto our neighbors.
Yeah, that is really well said. What do you hope this book accomplishes, Steve? If you were to hear a story and about someone and their behavior, or maybe a change of attitude or a change of heart, what would that story sound like? Where you'd be like, "That's what this book was supposed to accomplish. That's what it was supposed to do. It was worth writing because I've heard these stories."
If I heard stories of everyday Christians or congregations that decided to take seriously local embodiment of any one of the topics that I take on in the book, and those stories begin to make their way back to me, I would be thrilled. Because I think that the overarching message of the book is that the best way to be human is not to be American first, but to follow Jesus first. And I think that if we can say, man, American culture has some great things, but the way of Jesus ultimately gives us the richest experience of being human. And if we started hearing stories of racial reconciliation or radical generosity or those sorts of things in neighborhoods and communities coming out of churches, man, that would be a dream come true.
That is so awesome. How can people get a hold of you? Where can they pick up the book and keep up with your work?
Yeah, so I'm on most social media platforms. So you can find me on X or Twitter, whatever we're calling it these days, at Bezner. I'm also on Instagram at @sbezner. On Facebook as well, just my name's Steve Bezner. If you are someone who's curious to find out more about how we implement these things in our church, you can certainly look up our church, Houston Northwest Church, and we have a library of sermons that you're welcome to listen to, or you can actually kind of see some of the events that we hold to embody some of these things. Our next kind of big event like that would be our International Friendsgiving, where we'll have a traditional Thanksgiving dinner for people from all over the world. So it'll be a lot of fun.
Love it.
That's awesome.
And then the book, you can get the book pretty much anywhere. Amazon, Barnes & Noble, all that stuff.
Well, that's great. Well, Steve, thank you so much for being a guest on the program today.
Man, guys, thanks for having me. I really, really appreciate it, and I'm grateful for the opportunity.
Yeah, we're grateful to have you. And to our guest, this has been Steve Bezner. Again, you can pick up his book, Your Jesus is Too American. We encourage you guys to do that. We'll put links in the show notes to all of that. And thank you again for joining us. And until next time, keep your conversations not right or left, but up. Take care.
See ya.